Welcome to the Recover You podcast. I'm Kylene.
And I'm Patrick.
We are a couple in recovery
From sex addiction
and betrayal trauma. Together, we share our story to encourage you on your journey. It's here that we talk about sex addiction, betrayal trauma, mental, emotional, and physical health, faith, and anything and everything needed to recover you to your most authentic self that God created you to be.
Welcome to Recover You. Today, I'm going to be spending some time talking to Kylene and asking her questions about what it was like to go through those early months of betrayal, those early months of discovery, and then some various things. I think it's really important for both the addicted and the betrayed to hear this. I think for the betrayed, you may feel validated in some of your thought patterns that you're going through, and for the addicted, I think it's always important for us as we heal, we develop greater empathy. And with empathy comes the ability to kind of understand where people are, and don't shame them for feeling the way they're feeling, right? People feel the way they feel because that's how they feel. It sounds really simple, but it's okay to validate those feelings. So I think it's, coming from a couple that's in recovery, and we're still going through our own journey of healing. This may not be how you are feeling through your recovery process, but this is, certainly Kylene's story, and we want to make sure that we provide good insight and good information for the betrayed and the addicted.
Yeah, we sort of talked about this, I think, fairly recently, where we were like, we talk a lot about the reconciliation and tools for reconciliation. We talk a lot about the addict brain and recovery patterns for the addict and tools and resources. And we maybe don't have as many if we were to tally them up in terms of episodes around the betrayed, which is kind of interesting because that's what I primarily work with that's what I do with my clients is I work with the betrayed, and I am the betrayed. And so we were like, you know what, we should make sure that we bring more information around that as well. So I'm going to start, even though you're interviewing me, I'm going to start this episode with a little bit of a metaphor to kind of get us rolling.
Ooh, a metaphor.
A metaphor. So yesterday we had a really fun day. We have lived in this house for 4 years, and there's a mantle above the fireplace that we really wanted to have a piece of artwork on. It just would sort of tie together the room, and make it look nice. And we had an idea of what we wanted, and that didn't really pan out. And so sitting here, 4 years after we moved in, there was a day where I was like, oh my gosh, we just need to pick something and put it up there, even if it's not, what we permanently want. But I just really think it would be nice to have something up there. Otherwise, it's very, very empty, right? And the issue is with artwork the size that it needs to be to look appropriate in the space. Legitimate artwork would cost a lot of money. And so we don't want to make a quick decision on that, right? So I was like Googling some stuff, and there's like this website like bigcanvasart.com or something like that, right? Like it's like huge canvases, but it's much less expensive, like way more affordable. And so then I was like, okay, cool. Well, if we can find something, we can try it out. And then if we like it, awesome. And we can kind of get used to it in that space. And if we don't, it's not going to be a big deal in a couple of years because we didn't drop, thousands and thousands of dollars on it. So we get this artwork and we're like, oh, that was really cool. It's really pretty. It's beautiful colors. But then I'm looking at the room and I'm like, this now needs more color because we have very neutral tones, but the artwork itself is very colorful. So where I'm going with this in terms of a metaphor is when we made the decision about the artwork and we put it in the space, that sort of acted as a catalyst and it acted as a vision. So once we had the artwork in the room, I could very clearly see what it was that we needed to put the room together. And so we had a really fun day yesterday, going from place to place. We got a couple new plants to add some greenery and color to the room. We got some fake flowers to put on the shelves next to it to take up some wall space there. We got some color to put on the beige couch that would kind of tie into the artwork itself. And so all of these little things really kind of made the room come together, and it feels comfortable and safe and happy and pretty. And it just worked, right? But what was really required for us to make those decisions was a vision. There was something that we needed to build it around. And you hear the two of us talking about this all the time, is that, I encourage my betrayed clients to have a vision of where you're going in your relationship. and maybe this is something you do with your therapist or your coach or your practitioner, and maybe it's something that you're very, very clear on yourself. Either way, it's important to really decide and determine what is actually healthy and what is the place that as a couple and as an individual you want to get to in life and in this relationship. Because once that is determined and once that is clear, you can create the steps that the steps of how to get there all of a sudden sort of show themselves. But if we don't know where we're going, it's going to be really, really hard to decide where we're going to get or how to get there. And when we're talking about the early stages of betrayal and kind of discovering this, I know it can feel really overwhelming. And you're like, what the heck is the next thing to do? And so even though it may feel difficult in the early stages, I would say even this might not be the thing to do like month one, you're, stabilizing, but within that first year, really getting solid on what that vision is, because then it allows you to know exactly, what is it that's not working for us to actually accomplish that. And so I just thought that was a good little visual metaphor. We chose the one thing, and then the rest of the room we were able to kind of make decisions with everything else.
There's a lot of ways to do that. I've heard of couples that have vision boards. And Chris, that's going to be hard, right, in the early stages of betrayal, because you don't know whether you're going to make it as a couple. But I took the group that I led through an exercise where they spent 15 minutes just writing, and they couldn't stop writing, and it was where they wanted to be in 5 years. Mm-hmm. And so for 15 minutes they wrote, and so that's it. It's a similar type thing. It actually creates it, and then they can start to formulate, okay, where are they going with this? So okay, so I have some questions for you today.
Shoot.
And I think a lot of people, if you've listened to the podcast for a while, our story. It was a discovery. I didn't come forward. It was a discovery, and there was a bit of a trickle disclosure as well. There was I wasn't open and honest from the get-go, and it took me a while to kind of lean into that. And so I think the first question I have is, what was going through your head when it started to come out? There was day one, of course, and there was some craziness going on there, a lot of uncertainty and things like that. But what was going through your head, let's say, over the first, 2 weeks? Like what was really kind of just bouncing through there? Can you just describe how you felt, what was going on inside of your brain at the time?
That's kind of hard because I feel like it's really complex what happens in those first couple weeks. So I think the first thing is like extreme overwhelm.
Yeah.
And I think it was a lot of shock. I know it was a lot of shock. I stayed in shock for maybe, I've always thought it ended up, I didn't feel like I was in shock for a long period of time, but I think a lot of people misunderstand what shock feels like. You can actually be very productive in shock. You get a lot done. You sort of, help your partner connect to the right resources. You're sort of in stabilization, but your brain is like not truly processing. So it's just it felt like a flood of information, and it felt so antithesis and so against what I thought we were and who I thought you were, that I really had no concept of like how to digest that. It made absolutely no sense to me. The really, 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 really early on, before I knew the full context, I felt really bad for you the whole time, but I felt really bad for you really early on, because when it started coming out, you broke down and you were explaining how horrible it was for you and how sorry you were. And you really don't emotionally break down. And so within the first couple of days when that happened, I felt a lot of compassion for you in that moment. But and I did through the whole process, but then it started to get mixed with a lot of anger and a lot of like grief and a lot of shock, because I had so many questions, because it felt like, I think we described this in one of the earlier podcasts. It was like we were living this life and it looked a certain way. And then there's like this transparent page over it that was pulled away, and underneath the transparent page is all this darkness that I had no concept was around me. No concept. And if I had, I would not have liked that, or just, you know what I mean? Like I would have, maybe this process would have started earlier in some way, shape, or form. Right. And so That's a really hard question, I think, to answer because it's so many emotions all happening at once, and you're just trying to figure out which direction is up.
What seemed to help you, if there was anything, in those first, let's say, 1 day to 3 to 4 weeks? What seemed to help you settle in the moment, if there was anything?
Oh, I don't think in the first couple of days, I don't think I was settled at all. I mean, in the first couple of months, I had several panic attacks. And I think what's weird about the emotional side, though, is, and I kind of end up explaining this to clients a lot, is in the shock phase, you get so much done. Like, you are sad, you are angry, you are grieving, all these kinds of things. Like, that's true. That does happen in the shock phase. But you don't feel the actual depth of those emotions until the shock is gone.
Mm-hmm.
So that can actually happen months later. Like, for me, it was several months later. And so I think what's actually happening here is when you're in shock, you are creating safety and stability. And so your defense mechanisms are way up. So all of your protector parts are going to come up and they're going to protect you in a variety of different ways. And some of that is going to be not feeling the long-term impact of some of what's happening in the moment. And so then when you feel safe and stabilized and the shock has worn off, and for me, again, that was several months into it, then some of the realization of the longer impact and the deeper emotions and the actual trauma of it settles in. And so that's a different story. So it's not that the emotions don't exist the first days to a couple weeks. It's just like how maybe you're experiencing them might shift over time.
How did in that shift of emotions, did the polygraph and the full therapeutic disclosure seem to indicate a emotional shift? Was that part of that, or not?
Yes. So to your earlier question about what maybe kind of helped me in the first parts, I think the fact that we were able to connect to resources immediately, and I knew that there was a plan, sort of like when you got connected to Conquer and you walked away and you were like, oh, there's a step-by-step way for me to heal. The fact that I had that information provided to me so quickly that the addict could heal and that there were also things to help me heal, that provided a tremendous amount of stability. So you and I jumped in faster than a lot of people are even able to because they don't know that these resources exist, which again is one of the reasons we do this podcast, because we want to make sure people get connected as quickly as possible. So that did provide a lot of stability for me. And then your response to everything that was happening and your ability to stay in sobriety in the first couple of days and first couple of weeks, that helped with the stability a lot. So then within a couple months, we were moving towards that full disclosure. And for me, having that and having the polygraph, it was a huge milestone in terms of like hitting a recovery milestone and getting the information that I wanted and feeling like, okay, like you passed it. Like this is like a huge accomplishment, I think, for both of us, right? However, and again, what I see a lot of times with betrayed partners is that's a lot of stability created. So now you feel safe. So then that was in the first half of the first year, right? I still really struggled a lot longer than that.
Of course.
And so I think after the stability and the safety was created, which those played a huge part in, which is why I recommend them so highly, never skipping those steps. Because in my mind, it's like, if we hadn't done that and we had just tried to navigate this on our own and we didn't have like a structure associated with it, I do not know that we would have survived.
Well, what's interesting, and I think about this, you at least the way my brain works is you have the ability to move on. I think that's one of the amazing parts of the brain sometimes. And I don't think I would have been able to get everything out there. So that probably would have led to a continued like trickle disclosure, year and a half on. You'd be like, wait. And I'd be like, oh yeah. You know what I mean? And so that would have been really bad for you.
Well, I think even on the betrayed side, if you don't have a structure for thinking through and somebody supporting you in thinking through what are all the things you need to know, because I was so naive, and I think that plays into like why disclosure is so important. That
even in which way?
That I didn't, until this started coming out, I had no idea the spectrum of things you could even be exposed to or involved with. Mm-hmm. So it's like, you might have said one thing to me, like, oh, I looked at porn or I had a porn addiction. my mind might interpret that in one way that's very, 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 very different than what you were actually engaging in.
Right.
And so part of the importance of disclosure is actually learning, and again, not gory details, not things that are like extra traumatizing for your brain, but for me, I think it's very important that the spouse is aware of the pillars of behavior, like what were the actual types of behavior engaged in and where on the spectrum is the behavior. Because when I went into this, I was super, super naive. And so in my head, I had a certain thing in mind. When I started asking questions and I started to understand the world, it was a very different picture. So when it comes to disclosure, providing safety, it's not that it's not really scary. It's not that it's not really hard. It's not that it doesn't provide really painful information about infidelity. But then you know who you're married to and what their struggles were and how bad it was.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that's a requirement in order for me to have consent in the relationship.
Right.
So that was very, very important to me. And so anyway, I think part of the reason the disclosure and doing it through a therapeutic way and having a coach or a therapist who's familiar with the process help you through it, they guide you through like what questions is it that you need to have answered to know who you're married to and to be able to offer that consent. And so I think the structured process that we were introduced to and that I sometimes help my clients with now is that it helps you get the truth and understand kind of what's out there in a way, right? Like sometimes I'll ask my clients a question like, do you need to know this? And they're like, I didn't even know, like that had never even crossed my mind, right?
Right.
And then they find out, okay, well that maybe he was involved in that, right? And so it's a really hard thing because it comes with, both sides, like the pain of it, but also the safety of knowing.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I do think that was really important.
So there's always the addict is going through a lot. The betrayed is going through a lot. What behaviors did I demonstrate that did not help?
That really only happened a couple times, I think. So the addict feels so much shame around like the spouse that knows that what they're doing is wrong and they want to recover, which is what you were. Feels so much shame around the behavior itself and so much guilt around the behavior itself that part of the recovery process is learning how to separate those and how to actually heal from the shame. So what would bother me sometimes is in your desire and effort towards healing, your personal pursuit towards healing, there would be a couple instances where you were trying, and I get this and I believe in it to an extent, but I think it just manifested in an irritating way. Through your process of trying to deal with shame, you were trying to like yourself again, and you were trying to build confidence. And there were just a couple situations where it came off a little cocky or insensitive, and that really annoyed me based on this situation.
Mm-hmm.
And I did not appreciate that, and I sort of made that known really quickly.
Yeah. Now, what about the others? What behaviors did you find were most helpful through that process at any stage?
Actually, let me add another one to that first part,
okay,
because I think it's really, really common. And you've mentioned this on the podcast before. Another thing that was not helpful was the avoidant attachment right away.
Sure.
So the inability in the very beginning and it wasn't like 100% all the time, because those first couple days you really did sit through a lot of really hard conversations. But as we progressed through healing, there were those times where not every conversation was resolved immediately, and you would sort of like just disconnect and walk away. And that was not helpful. Over time, you figured out how to come back and complete it. Even if there was like an interrupt in the middle where you walked away, you'd come back. And then eventually, I think you learned how to just not maybe do that at all, for the most part. But I think that I wanted to mention that because actually that's a really, 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 what I have seen working with betrayed clients is that I still have, I'm trying to think if there's an exception to this. I'm not sure I've been exposed to one yet that almost every single addict has that avoidant tendency, because that's part of what plays into the addiction itself. Is like, I don't know how to manage my emotions. I don't know how to sit through something uncomfortable. That's why I go self-medicate, right? That's why I go distract and numb and avoid. So they're kind of forced into the deep end with discovery, right? Because we're asking 10 million questions. We're like, really devastated me. And that's going to hurt them as well. So that was another thing that I think was unhelpful that resolved over time as you got into healing and we kind of navigated those conversations. The things that you did well was you got into healing and you stayed into healing. You stayed with all of the behaviors and practices. So again, I see this a lot with clients that what they're very much looking for is proactive behavior. They don't want to just say, we really don't want to just go or think that you're going through the motions of recovery because we asked you to. We want you to go through recovery because you want to, and through that process feel like we are priority number one, that you love us enough and care about us enough to go through this hard thing and prioritize it over every other thing in life, every other thing. And so when betrayed partners do not feel prioritized, it plays into the exact wound that betrayal brought to the surface of rejection, not being good enough, not being prioritized. And so if there's other patterning in the behavior before, or other wounds in the betrayer's life or the betrayed partner's life before, then that is going to play right into it. So what we look for is consistency and a feeling of being valued and prioritized through this process. And those are two things I think you did really, really well, because I could tell very early on, like within the first couple of weeks, even maybe within the first couple of days, that this was something that you personally desperately wanted. And so when women see that, when betrayed partners see that, it gives them a lot of hope, because we know, hey, this is something that you are going to take responsibility for. Because another thing that I see betrayed partners struggle with a lot is feeling like they have to be a parent, right? So when the addict can take personal responsibility for their own recovery, it's very encouraging, because that indicates to us that it's not only sincere, but that it will be a more long-term thing. So you did that really well. I saw you jump into, you're like, what is a helpful resource? Cool, I will do that. Do I need therapy? I will do that. But not only, it wasn't just you checking off the boxes because I said, oh, hey, this is the process, go see a CSAT. You would come home and say, this is what I learned. This makes so much sense about my brain. This is helping me feel like I never have to do this again. Right. And then, so you did the recovery activities consistent. I mean, you still do certain things of it like on a daily basis, habits that you established very early on to replace you would act out in the morning. So now you have a morning routine and you still do that morning routine, right? So I've seen that happen like literally every single day for years. And so that consistency and proactivity on your part has really helped. And over time, that has shifted from learning about and recovering from addictive patterns into how can I just grow more deeply as a person, self-development, continuing to learn, continuing to expand my mind, those sorts of things, right? And so for me, I go, you are somebody that wants to learn and is interested in that as a long-term thing forever. So that's helpful. And then the empathy piece and the feeling like a priority and valued. Empathy was something you've always had, I feel like, a really fairly good level of that. I do think it changed and grew as you went through recovery and learned a lot more. You were never someone that wanted to hurt anybody, right? So you were always like soft-hearted in that you never wanted to cause anybody pain, and you would take responsibility and apologize if you thought you did. I think as you went through this process, your ability to empathize and sit through difficult conversations and verbalize back, I'm sorry that I did this horrible thing that hurt your feelings. I understand why you feel this way, and actually put it into the words that I was feeling. That also very helped a lot. So I think those are some things that, in terms of, quote unquote, what you did well, I think taking responsibility was like the number one thing. Never, ever did you blame me a single time, or put any of it on me a single time. And I had a lot of questions about, well, how could someone that I thought I was in a good relationship with, had a good marriage with, I liked a lot, you liked me a lot, like, how could this happen? You would sit there and answer those questions. And even as I started to understand the addict brain and I started to understand recovery, sometimes I would have a sticking point and I would get stuck and I'd be like, well, how did you think about this? How did you think about this? And you would answer those questions. Because one of the things I wanted to know was, how did you think then? And how do you think now? How is this different? I need to know because you were nice to me then, you're nice to me now.
Mhm.
Now, I just mentioned some things that have changed.
Mhm.
So that's nice to be able to hold on to those patterns and behaviors. But in terms of like, you were never mean to me. And, we didn't have like a volatile, argumentative, confrontational relationship. So it's not like you got out of this negative patterning and then your personality changed, right?
Mhm.
So there were some pieces in there where I had a lot of questions out, like, how can I trust that this is different? And we would talk through that and you would share like, well, this is how I'm thinking about things differently. And that was helpful.
Yeah. Okay. The one thing that really helped me early on was you were very action oriented, and the steps that you would be like, no, we're going to do this. I remember, and I probably wouldn't have thought of this, but you were like, the phone's going to stay at home till we kind of figure this out as to what's happening. And
Oh yeah, that was within the first couple days.
yeah, and we did that. And so I think the question is how did you develop that clarity as to what needed to be done? When did that clarity develop in the process, if you can recall?
Well, to be really honest, I'm a little bit of a bossy person in general. Well, come on, I have a tendency to you'll admit it.
Yeah, I don't know if I've ever seen that part.
I have a tendency to be like, if I've made a decision, this is how it's going to be, right?
Mm-hmm.
And with this, I felt every right to do that because the alternative was divorce, essentially,
Mm-hmm.
right? So the clarity I think came from once somebody handed me, they're like, these are the steps, right? Which is again what we do in the podcast, what I do with my clients. Like, let's go through all these steps. Let's not skip them because there are reasons. Parts of them help you heal, parts of them help him heal, parts of them help you heal as a couple, develop trust, all these sorts of things, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's really important. But beyond that, like to answer that question about the phone, for example, it was about my comfortability and my safety in a lot of ways, but also really, really early on while I was figuring things out, I took responsibility to help you as the addict not relapse. And I was like, until we figure this out, you are like locked down. And so it was a combination of, I will help you because you were willing to be helped and you wanted my help. I couldn't have taken your phone away unless you agreed to it. There's no way I could have done that. So I was like, I feel like this is what needs to be done. But you wholeheartedly were in the process and agreed with me. I could not have made that happen one way or another, right? If you weren't totally on board with the recovery process, period. So this is, again, it's not about controlling the other person, boundaries and things like that. What I talk to clients about boundaries, the primary thing about a boundary is about your personal safety and about health in the relationship. But when you have a partner that is willing to do the recovery work, some boundaries are actually about accountability. And so in the very, very early part of recovery, some of those boundaries are going to look a little different. So I'll give you like two different examples. So a boundary around accountability would be that, right? Like, you're not taking your phone into the bathroom until we figure this out, because I'm helping you as your current accountability partner before you get connected to all these things, before we lock it down, before we do XYZ, before your brain has calmed down in the first 90 days, all of those things. Then, okay, you're not going to do this. You're not going to take your phone to work until we figure this out. You're not going to, those types of things. That's an accountability boundary because you wanted accountability and you were participating in it. A personal safety boundary is, you're not sleeping in the same room with me today because I don't feel safe and I need my space.
Mm-hmm.
So those are different. And usually people are going to focus on the safety boundaries. If you have a partner that is engaged wholeheartedly in recovery and wants to participate in the accountability in the relationship, that's where stuff like that comes in.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What gave you strength through this? What was a podcast or a song or a friend that gave you strength through this process?
That's hard to answer because I didn't really feel very strong through the process.
Okay. That's interesting. Yeah. You were very strong through the process. Yeah. Was there anything in particular that gave you a little, maybe changed the word from strength to hope? What gave you hope?
Oh man, those are like totally different things, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, well, so you mentioned podcast and we promote it like crazy on here. I listened to the Pure Desire podcast. One of the reasons that was so helpful was for the same reasons that the Conquer program was helpful to you. They take the therapeutic model, they educate about the brain, they understand that it's trauma based, both on the betrayed partner and the addicted partner. And so learning about that was very validating, very helpful. I started listening to the podcast to learn about addiction more because I was in the beginning, I was trying to learn about both, but I was really trying to help you and really trying to figure
Mm-hmm.
out like what was going on. Because for me to think through decisions and processes and staying together, I really needed to have an understanding of what was happening in your life and your brain. And so I started listening to that podcast just to learn about the addiction side. I still listen to it almost every single week,
Mm-hmm.
even though maybe a lot of the information I already know now, or it's not maybe directly applicable to me, but I still love it. I still listen to it. So that was really helpful. And then in terms of hope, um, hearing them on the podcast regularly as people in recovery, not relapsing, that gave me hope. Hearing that certain leaders were in the education around sex addiction and stuff, like Ted Roberts, like Doug Weiss, people like that. And you may not, every person that gets that place of recovery that has a platform of education, you might not agree with every single strategy or every single thing that they say ever, but to see that there were people out there that had gone through multiple layers of addiction, pain, all this kind of stuff, and had successfully navigated recovery and had done so for years, if not decades, that provided a lot of hope for me. So I really needed to hear the stories that people had truly gotten into recovery. They were truly successful. They were not relapsing, because what I was hearing a lot was relapse is inevitable. Addiction is a disease, which means it's going to be there for life. These mindsets that are not encouraging at all. And it's very limiting and what's the word? Imprisoning, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mentally, physically, and emotionally. And so to hear people that had a different perspective, took the trauma approach, really believed in true recovery, gave examples that they were living in true recovery, that was very hopeful for me.
Okay. When did you feel most vulnerable? Like, was there a moment through the process when you just were like, I don't know if I'm going to make it personally, not our relationship, but like, was there a moment when it just like it felt like the bottom was dropping out?
What do you mean personally versus our relationship?
I mean, our relationship's one thing, right?
Mhm.
But just the overall emotion, the grief, the sorrow, all of these things where it was just so overwhelming that you just were like, I don't know if I can even get up out of bed. Was there ever a moment like that?
I don't even know if there was a moment as much as there was just like that whole first year,
Yeah.
to be honest.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I went to the hospital twice because my periods were so painful that first year. So I was in extreme pain and the ambulance would have to come get me. What's really interesting about that, when you talk about emotions being associated, there was one particular time where I called the hospital. After I had called them, I ended up crying, and it was like a why me situation. Like, why does this stuff always happen to me? And why is this why, like all this pain, all these bad things, right? And when I released and I was just really crying and letting it out, the pain went away.
Mm.
By the time the ambulance got there, I wasn't in pain. They still took me to the hospital, but I was like, this is silly. I don't hurt anymore. But it was when I was crying. And so there's an extreme connection to emotions and stuck emotions with physical pain and manifestation in the body. So there were a lot of moments like that throughout the first year where I don't know if it was in the first year or the second year. I think it might have been the second year. I had like extreme back pain for a long time. I was going to PT. I was going to all these things. Um I don't know if it was acupuncture, chiropractic, whatever it was. I was doing a bunch of different things, right? And then at one point I was like, I'm pretty sure that this has to do with some emotions that I'm really holding on to, or like parts of my healing that I'm like stuck on.
Mm-hmm.
And I did end up getting this physical therapy that was very supportive, but I do still kind of think that, it's all combined, right? You can help the physical muscles, but if and you can get a therapy that's like more effective than another. But if you're not dealing with the spiritual, emotional aspect underneath it, then it's going to come back or it's not going to fully go away. Right. And so I dealt with a lot of that kind of stuff, which was really crazy. And then I had extreme depression. So like some days were like really hard to get out of bed. And just basically a lot of my life fell apart that first year. Like I didn't, do as much in my business. And so that really declined a lot. And it was just hard for me to function, really. So I don't know if there's like a specific moment as much as there was just a lot, like the first year to 2 years. So it's just a lot.
So what were, and maybe you won't be able to answer but it's a two-part question. I was going to ask you, like, what were your top three, like, saddest moments? And then conversely, what over the last 3.5 years, what's been your top three amazing moments that you're like most proud of?
I don't know if I can do three, but I can't. So thinking about the saddest, probably the first 48 hours. It was just so sad.
Yeah.
To see like your emotion, your collapse, your devastation, while also trying to process mine, like what was happening. So that was really
hard.
That was just like it's like if you were like standing on top of the Empire State Building and then it just disappeared and you were just free falling to the ground and you're like, what just happened? There was no warning.
Yeah.
There was nothing in my life where I was like somewhat prepared for that information. So then you just slam on the ground and you're like, wait, how many bones are broken? Am I still alive? So that was really, really, really rough. And then another sad moment I think was really hard for me would have been the second year that we would have hit what would have been our 10-year anniversary.
Yeah.
That one was really, 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 really hard for me because I had, for all of our relationship, sort of been moving towards the 10-year. I was really excited about the possibility of hitting a 10-year anniversary, of celebrating that, of like hitting that milestone for me. For whatever reason, for probably many, that was a particular milestone that I was looking forward to and moving towards and wanted to hit. And then I felt like that was taken away. Yeah. And then as we navigated our quote unquote anniversary, our old anniversary, I just didn't like it. I didn't like it. And so we had to kind of figure out what we wanted to do around that. I just felt, when we talked about this on the podcast, I just felt like everything was a lie. So I think if I had to say like the third moment, although I think this is thousands of moments over the past several years, right? The third thing would be grieving all of the things that we lost throughout the process. So yes, you're creating something new. Yes, there's hope in that. Yes, there's excitement in that. But there's still the other side of it, which is the reality and the sadness and the grieving of every single piece that you lost that you thought you were building this thing on.
Right.
So that's been really hard. And it's still sometimes really hard because it's like trying to redefine something and create something that's completely separate from what we had before. Sometimes that's exciting and sometimes that's devastating. So I think that's maybe the third one is just like thousands of those moments combined over the past several years where it's just like, yes, there's goodness. Yes, there's more depth. Yes, there's a difference in the relationship. And the reality of how we got here and the things that we lost. When I thought I was living like on my side for the years that we were together, I was like totally sincere and totally in love and totally present in the relationship. So it's weird because you feel like I showed up sincerely and now that's invalidated.
Right.
Because of someone else's behavior. And that's very, very, very difficult because it just feels, I don't want to say like a waste, but it's like, it's just, you lose it. You lose the value of that and it feels
well, I think
different.
I think this is really important for the addicted, that just if you were dozing while you were talking, rewind this real quick and go through it again. Because when you the questions, why can't you get over this? Why can't, you know what I mean? That's really important. It's because you had this foundational life that you thought, and it all was blown up.
Yeah.
And so what, what's the foundation now? Where do you go? Now, some folks can maybe rationalize that a little bit differently than others because we're all different.
Yeah.
But I think it's really important. And, it's hard for me to hear those things, right? Because I knew when I was present, you know what I mean, and all these wonderful, but it's very hard to convince you of those things. And so it and there's a lot of folks that are public in this space that will talk about that, the previous and the post, and stuff like that. And there's a reason why they do. Yeah.
Did I share this analogy on another episode? Stop me if I did, but I used this in a client call, and it's kind of around this topic. Is that the couples running a relay race together? Did I talk about that?
I think you have, but go ahead.
So it's like when you're talking about why can't somebody just get over it, you are running a relay race together, and you trust as the spouse that your partner is going to hand you the baton.
Mm-hmm.
And you've done it a million times, and you have a foundation, and you have trust built in your team, right? And then the day of discovery, or whenever this happens, or confession, however it happens, your spouse, instead of handing you the baton, which you expect and are relaxed and feel safe accepting, they hand you a bomb instead.
Yeah.
And then your life is destroyed. So you have to think about it in a sense, maybe a metaphor, maybe in a visual that makes sense to you, because how can somebody just come back from that? Yeah. You can do the healing, you can do the PT work, he can help you through the hospitalization process, he can provide safety, but for you to start practicing the relay race again and trust that he's going to hand you the baton, that is going to take some time. Just because he's handed you a baton 10 times after he handed you a bomb does not mean that you're going to be like, oh, he's handing me a baton, I feel totally safe accepting that. No, you're going to look, you're going to double check before, like the safety, like before you start the race, you're going to check the baton, make sure nothing's hidden. Yeah. You're going to look back when you're reaching for it. You're going to do all of those things. So when I hear that, like, why can't somebody get over it? It's just such a deep lack of understanding of what trauma actually is. This is not just something that happened in the betrayed partner's life. This is an extreme trauma. And whatever version of trauma, whether it's molestation or rape or PTSD from war veterans or whatever it is that you can relate to in your mind and your emotions, you need to overlay that with understanding how your partner is responding, because that is what they're going through.
Yeah, I think, and also, if you're the addict, this is a really great moment to exercise some patience, and it's not always easy, right? But, healing and recovery can generate amazing new things. So allow that process to happen. Don't try to fit into a rigid, but we always had an anniversary party and everybody came over. Like, well, it's okay to change that. You know what I mean? Like, you don't, this is for you as a couple. And if you got to redefine it, then redefine it. I do know, like, there's been a couple of times where you're like, I don't know what to do with, like, our wedding pictures. And I always just say, hang on to them. You don't have to make a decision today. Like, maybe in that first year, out of some anger, you throw a couple away or something like that. That's okay. You know what I mean? But, like, just hang on to them, because you never know where your thoughts and emotions are going to go over 5-10 years. You may go, you know what? I feel more comfortable looking at
That's a good point, because I think that's a really good thing to bring up through this is be willing to hold the boundaries that help you feel safe, and know that the safer you feel, you may reconsider some of them later.
That's right.
Absolutely. And so, like, actually, the anniversary thing is a good idea. It's not necessarily triggering, like, to me at all. I almost didn't even remember that it was our old anniversary, the day that it was our old anniversary this year,
right?
At all. Yeah. So it doesn't necessarily mean like, oh, this thing was hurtful and that's why we moved away from it. It's always going to be hurtful. We were able, let me move into actually the second part of your question, which is the 3 happiest, right? Because that goes into what I'm talking about here. We were able to essentially pick a different day to celebrate. And so because of that, it's like, okay, well, that's the new thing to think about. And it's totally separate and it's not related. And so when it came to what our old anniversary would have been, I don't really, it's like, what year is it technically, legally, that we're married? Like, oh, like I didn't even really think about it. I just
Mhm.
it wasn't really a thing this year. So that's, I mean, that's good, right? So in terms of like three happiest, I think it was your question. Um, this is gonna sound really weird. One of them was, and we shared this in the sexuality episodes, our process of reconnecting sexually. The day that I basically was like, okay, you can see me naked, like totally naked.
Mhm.
That sounds so weird that would be a happy moment.
Mhm.
But the reason it was happy is because it was really hard for me to get up to that point. There was a lot of trust building, and the emotional release and trauma that I felt move through my body and release through my body when we completed that exercise
Mhm.
was I was standing there literally allowing myself to be seen, and it was very vulnerable. And then your response was just really overwhelming, because we shared this in the episode too. Like you and didn't tell me at the time, but I felt it. And then we talked about it later. And I was like, oh, I felt so like such love and safety in that moment. And you were literally whooshing me with like love and safety with your energy.
Mhm.
And so that was like a really happy moment that I had accomplished that, because there's just so much underneath that, so much fear, so much pain, so much, insecurity, so all of those things, right? So
Mhm.
that was a really happy moment. I think another happy moment, and I don't know if these would be like my top three, because I might think later and go, oh, I missed one. But another one was when we did the photo shoot last year together, because kind of what you had just mentioned, there were a lot of memories and pictures and wedding stuff that we took down, and to me felt very tainted, and we put them in a drawer and things like that. And the photo shoot that we did, we took at a time where we were feeling really, really good about our relationship. We had come through a lot, and we were really connected and really happy and really relaxed. And so it was like the perfect time to take those photos and like capture what we might, describe as the new relationship. And so that was like a really happy, fun day. And I think the
Mhm.
pictures are really beautiful. And
Yeah.
so to have something new that you can frame and kind of, that was really
Mhm.
cool. And then the third one, it's funny because like two of the three involve me like crying a lot, but the third
It's
one,
pretty standard.
yeah, the third one would have been, well, it's like the happiest moments is it's like the two sides of the coin, right?
Mhm.
Also have to do a lot with overcoming trauma.
Right.
And so like that's a huge accomplishment. It's like climbing the freaking mountain,
Mhm.
and you're on top and you have this trauma release and the tears come, and you're like, "Oh my gosh, that was so hard, but we made it to the top of the mountain," and
Right. Right.
it's kind of that. So the third one would be, I think, when you surprised me one day. I mean, I knew it was coming. We talked about it, but you literally like showed up at the house and were like, "It's today." And you sat me down on the couch and you read me that really beautiful letter, and you gave me a new ring.
Mhm.
And so that was just really overwhelming to hear like your thoughts in the letter, and to have, that sort of presented in such an authentic
Yeah.
way that kind of surprised me in the moment. I was like, I'm not all made up. I'm not yet.
Oh, yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
sitting on the couch.
Right.
No, but that was really nice too. So those are really big moments, I think.
I have two more
Okay.
questions. So the second to last one is, what negative belief do you think you had, or wound coming into betrayal, do you think betrayal really magnified?
Mm. I think that one of the biggest ones for me was like comparison and body image.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I had just gone through chemo too, and so my body had changed, and then within that year my body was still recovering from that, and then I started to feel really good about myself again, and then this hit, and I felt horrible about myself. um and I think that's one that a lot of women can relate to. It's a primary one that I see
Mhm.
show up, is the comparison and the body image, because the reason that ends up being so sticky and so strong for most of us is because it's a wound we've carried through much of our life, right? Like I was aware of how my body looked way young, right? And wanted to be super skinny and all these kinds of things, and I've always been very aware of that, right? So I think for most of us, we start thinking about that create beliefs about our value or our attractiveness or whatever, or our worth around those things from a very early age. So then when betrayal hits and you have a spouse who's literally looking at other bodies, that wound comes right up to the surface, and it just really, really hurts, like tremendously. So, I mean, I remember, and that showed up for me, like when we were, it's like the stupidest thing, but I'm going to say it because other people will probably relate to it. When you when you find out that your spouse has been looking at other people, in your mind, unless you've been personally exposed, which I do not recommend, to the content that they have been viewing, what you're doing instead is creating visual images in your mind. Well, what is your mind going to create? It's going to create the image that you are like most afraid of, right? This thing that you think is more attractive than you. Mm-hmm. And so your mind is now filled with pornographic images of things that you think are more attractive than you. And you're sitting here having an argument with your spouse, so snot running down your tears are running down your face, your nose is getting all snotty. And so I remember, like, in the early several weeks, even a couple months, feeling so insecure if we were having an argument or discussion about what was going on and I was gathering more information and I was crying. I felt like I had to at least look put together. Like, was my hair, because my hair was still growing out, so it was very short at the time. I was like, I wanted my hair to look nice. I wanted to look pretty as much as I possibly could when we were having, because it was vulnerability. So if I was going to be vulnerable, I wanted to at least feel attractive, or whatever base version of that I could come up with at the time to feel somewhat presentable. That was hard. And I think about last night, because we had a thing last night and I'm crying and I'm snotty. I'm wearing my baggy t-shirt and my hair is that, and I did not look great last night. So, I mean, that's an example of healing where it's like, I feel back in my body, safe in my body again, to be myself and to fall apart and all that kind of stuff without having to put on any sort of like, I don't know, external, however you describe that. But I think that's a very, very, very common one.
So the final question I have, and then I have some commentary, but I think is, when did you start to feel like I was in recovery? How long was that when you started to be like, okay, yeah, I know that what he's saying is true? And you could just, was it a general feeling, or was it when the private eye gave you the report? Like when exactly?
It did not.
I know.
You take that back.
Yeah. No, I'm just like,
give people ideas.
Like what, what was it when you started to feel like you didn't have to do an extreme amount of checking? And things like that.
Like different questions, I think. Okay, well, let's start with the last one, the checking, because one of the things that I was doing right away. Now, part of this was to make sure that I had all the information.
Sure.
And part of it was also because, like I said earlier, you wanted the accountability, and I was determined to help you succeed. While also protecting myself. Right. So we've talked about, one of the things that I did was go into your email. And one of the reasons I went into your email was I was deleting any possible temptation that might have existed while you were trying to get into sobriety. Right. And so I was like, I'm going to be that person. I'm going to bite the bullet. I would go into the email. I would go into your spam and delete your spam. I would go into your messages and I would search certain keywords and find up what was in your history and try to delete those. Yeah. So that was traumatizing for me, because I was unfortunately exposed to a couple somewhat mild things. That was difficult, but I was like also doing it for information for myself. And it kind of did help in some ways, because I saw it was like a really long thing. You'd been engaged in it for a long time. It gave me some information, like you had signed up for like a blocker on your phone before. So I knew, right. So it was helpful in terms of like seeing the patterns, understanding how long, and it was like a real problem and stuff like that. But it was also very, very painful. But one of the things in terms of like stopping looking, you recognized how hurtful that was to me to be doing that. And, but I also was like, but I don't want to just like leave your email, getting all this stuff. Right. Yeah. So you actually suggested, well, why don't we get rid of my old email and start a new one? That was really helpful. And then I suggested we set you up as a woman.
Yeah.
So we just got you a new email.
It works, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's two reasons it works. One, we put you as a woman, and two, you've never put that email into anything nefarious. So there's the algorithm. People get your email. You're going to keep getting the stuff that you've clicked
Mhm.
on, that
Mhm.
you've liked, that you've engaged in, or that you've given your email to.
Mhm.
So with a new email being set as a woman, you're less likely to be targeted, but then you haven't used your email to get any stuff. And so that's really helped. So that helped a lot. Um, Long term, though, I think it was the disclosure. I
Hmm.
think the disclosure kind of shut it down because I felt like I had all the information and you pass the polygraph. And so then after that, it was a matter of, okay, if I'm triggered, we're talking about the trigger itself. And
Mhm.
over time, learning how to ask fewer questions about the content of the behavior itself.
Right.
What
Right.
was the original question though? Because I think that was only a part of it.
I just said, when did you start to feel like I was doing better and
Oh,
I was
doing better.
sincere?
Yeah. So that was the hypervigilance part that I just answered. But in terms of like trusting you, that it was sincere, I got a sense that you were for real very quickly, like within the first couple weeks to first couple months. Like I was pretty sure you were sincere about it. The question though, learning about addiction at the time and going through it personally and wanting to protect myself. And this is what I tell my clients too, right? Is you have to give it time. So I believed you, but I wanted to see it play out.
Mhm.
I knew you wanted recovery, but I wanted to see if you could do it. I knew you wanted to recover without relapsing, but was that possible for you?
Mhm.
Right? All of those things had to play out. And that's it. That's where the discomfort of time comes in. You have to let that play out. So I believed you very early. I could
Mhm.
tell, both by your words, your energy, and your behavior that you were taking it very seriously for yourself and that you were engaged and proactive, like we talked about at the beginning.
Mhm.
In terms of trusting from my side of things, that was a long, ongoing recovery, healing my own wounds,
Mhm.
working with practitioners, doing all the trauma work, that sort of thing. I think that took time. But in terms of believing you, I believed you really fast. I just needed to see that it would play out over time. And every year, the ability for me to believe that got deeper and deeper.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you. I know the process was really hard. And you talked about the devastation of watching me. I know one of my hard memories is of you in the closet when I was starting to like tell you, and just the devastation on your face. It was just, I just couldn't believe that I had done that. You know what I mean? Like it was just crazy to kind of think that through. And I think, I hope hearing you talk, because gives credence. It's not a fast process. You had a trigger last night. It was a mild trigger, but you had a trigger last night. And you and I are going on vacation, and we're going to a place that has a beach, and so we've talked about that. You know what I mean? Like, how are we going to manage that? You know what I mean? And so for the addicted, whether you like it or not, you did it, right? And so you have to recognize that, this isn't like when you were a little kid and you ate a cookie and then mom says, "Okay, I forgive you, that she loves you." And then you're like, "Yeah, you go on." I mean, there are some long-term consequences to this. And so it just, you got to keep that in mind. You got to understand that. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think that's where understanding the trauma side of it really comes in
Right.
because trauma is just not something that goes away overnight. You can do a lot of healing. Now, I do want to put a tiny little asterisk here. There may be betrayed partners out there that this was not a significant trauma for. I'm not sure I've really met one yet
Hmm.
personally, and
Sure.
because the women that I work with are going to have a significant trauma response and significant response to this. But I'm sure there are people out there that view it a little bit differently, and their response is not as great, and it doesn't end up being such a residual trauma. And so the response then may be a little bit different. But for a significant majority of betrayed partners, it is a trauma, like I mentioned earlier. And so I think for people on both sides to understand that, for example, you mentioned I had a small trigger last night and we talked about it and everything. And um, that doesn't necessarily mean that you haven't done the recovery work or that
Right.
you did anything
Yeah.
wrong or that
Yeah.
you're not in the healing place that you should be or that you guys are backtracking when that comes
Right.
up.
Right.
Trauma does not view time the same way our conscious brain does.
Hmm.
A trigger is very capable of making you feel the emotions that you felt before. Now, that's where the healing and the processing comes up because when you have processed and recovered and done a lot of the work, and the way I describe it is the more into recovery I got, the more it did become just a thought and less of a nervous system or an emotional response,
Hmm.
right? In the beginning, if I had a trigger, my whole nervous system was activated. There might be shaking, there might be a panic attack, there might be crying, there might be like 20 emotions coming up, right? Now it's like, hey, I saw this thing, it sort of reminded me of XYZ. It made me feel a little sad, right?
Hmm.
That's totally different. So yes, I think that's an important thing to communicate to partners. And one of the reasons I think is because there's this idea that, well, if we get into recovery, like we'll never have to talk about this again, or we'll never have to think about it again, or it will never impact our lives again. And that's not always for everybody the reality. And that doesn't mean you've done anything wrong, or you haven't engaged in the healing, or that life's not good, or you can't have a good relationship, or you can't live your life day to day very happy and satisfied. It doesn't mean any of those things. It just means that it ends up being a part of your life because it's something that happened to you, like a real thing that happened to you. So I think understanding trauma and how it works and how it doesn't view time the same way can be helpful for people to have a little more compassion around that aspect of it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think about where we've come from. Actually, I mean, more, this is more about you, where you've come from in the last 3.5 years, and the steps you've taken, and the hard things you've done to kind of put yourself back out there as far as performing. And we had talked about that. Some of the intimacy work that we had to do, which wasn't easy. I mean, that was scary. You could have just said no. You could have said no, and you don't deserve this. And you could have done all of those things, and yet you didn't, and you moved into it. And so it I think for the betrayed, your feelings are valid. Don't ignore them. Don't feel bad about them. You know what I mean? Don't feel guilty about them. You keep working on getting help. For the addicted, you can actually support your spouse through these things. You really, really can. And it's actually an honor to be able to do it, to be able to, like, I think about this, like you allowed me the space to help you through this. And from a shame, healing from shame, that's a pretty cool thing. It's a pretty cool thing to be allowed back onto the field, right? In a way to go through it. But yeah, I'm just really proud of you and how you've navigated through all of this, and the help that you bring to other people. And I've heard, the last podcast talked about that. And you've always been a very clear thinker, and I think that helped you through the healing process. It certainly helped me, through the healing process. And so, I'm very thankful for you. I'm very sorry. I think I always will be. But I just think I hope a lot of the betray can gain inspiration from you, because you've certainly been one for me. So,
Oh, thank you.
so anything you would like to add before we sign off?
Well, what you just said, in a lot of ways, you've been an inspiration to me too. I mean, I think through this process, you know, um, and I'm really really proud of you and all the hard work you've done because it's been hard for me to navigate this, right? But on the other side, it's been really hard for you.
Hmm. Hmm.
You had to heal from this thing that was really hard for you, and then you had to help me heal from the same thing, like in a way,
Right.
right? And so that's like a lot for people to go through.
Yeah.
And neither one of us woke up one day and was like, we're ready to do this. And it wasn't like
Right. Right.
you,
Yeah.
you don't open the door and say, like, this is the choice we're making today, right? No, we were both kind of thrown into it.
Hmm.
And so I'm really proud of you and the level of responsibility you've taken because I think you inspire a lot of people in this podcast. And I've heard that. I have feedback from people who absolutely love to hear your perspective on things. But I know you also do that in the groups that you lead as well. And even just the conversations you have and the way you view life, I think is very, very different now. You
Hmm.
view people differently.
Right.
You understand trauma, which gives you a completely different perspective
Right.
on people and their pain and the choices they make in life. And so I think for both of us, in like a weird way of having to go through all this pain, like it's really reshaped how we interact with other human beings.
Right.
And for me, I love that part of it. That part I think is really great. I think it's really helped both of us become better people
Yeah.
in a lot of ways. So, I mean, if we just wanted to kind of wrap it up and tie it back to the metaphor at the beginning, right? I think what allowed both of us to do that was, if you want to call it buying the painting, it was having the
Yeah.
vision
Oh, yeah.
that allowed us to create the structure around everything else.
hmm
And we're still doing that, right? And
Yeah.
we still have conversations around all of this, because neither one of us, I think, is somebody that wants to stay in the same spot very long
Yeah.
in life.
Well, a rigid vision that can't change is not going to be fully,
Yeah.
so you got to have a vision that's flexible, that you
Mhm.
can change to the good. You don't want to change it to the
Yeah.
bad. Be like, oh, I think relapse is okay. You know what I mean? Like you want to have a vision that evolves in a positive direction.
Yeah.
So thank you. This podcast wasn't supposed to be about me.
Well, good job. Well, thank you for interviewing me. Good interview skills.
Yay.
All right, everyone. We'll see you next week. Woohoo! If you're listening to this, it means you've made it through an entire episode. Part of recovery is spending time engaging in healing and self-growth activities. We are thankful that you chose our podcast to be one of those activities today. Make sure you reward yourself for that accomplishment. If you've enjoyed this episode or this podcast, we would love to hear from you. Please take just a few moments to leave a rating and review, letting us know your experience with Recover You. We not only love hearing how these episodes are helpful, but ratings and reviews help others just like you who are searching for recovery information and support find the podcast too. We can't wait to hear from you. See you next week.